Want to make sure that we keep on time today. Hello, everyone. I'm Eric Kova. I'm the communications director at Smart Growth America. Want to thank you so much for joining us today. For those of you who don't know us, Smart Growth America is a national nonprofit that helps create prosperous, healthy, and resilient places to live for all people through research, advocacy, and direct community support. And Transportation for America is a project of SGA, Transportation for America and Corrigan led on this report. But at T4A, we envision a transportation system that safely, affordably, and conveniently connects people of all means and abilities to jobs, services, and opportunity through multiple modes of travel. Y'all are here today to hear about our new report, Fueling the Crisis. And the report uses AI-assisted analysis to analyze the 2021 bipartisan infrastructure law. And so, as many of you know, the White House hailed the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act as a once-in-a-generation investment in our nation's infrastructure and competitiveness. They also made lofty promises that it would repair and rebuild our roads and bridges with a focus on climate change mitigation, resilience, equity, and safety for all users. Our report, led by Corrigan here, Fueling the Crisis, attempts to answer that question. Has that turned out to be the case? If you've looked at the report, giving you a little heads up, it has not. So with that introduction, I'm going to pass it off to my colleague, Corrigan Salerno, who is our policy manager at T4A and is the lead author and researcher for Fueling the Crisis.
Thanks, Eric. I'm gonna start sharing, our slides, not my Slack. One sec. There we go. Anyway, yeah, thanks, folks. Yeah, so we're going to be going over our Fueling the Crisis report and specifically our top level findings, as well as how advocates can actually use this data and go through and create their own versions of this report. It's specified to their own state level. So to frame up this report, we're talking about the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, or the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, passed in 2021 as the recent Surface Transportation Reauthorization. We had just recently hit the 3rd-year anniversary of the bill in November 15th. And since then, over 60,000 projects have been obligated to funding towards, and there's been thousands of announced discretionary grants funded as well, or announced for funding as well. And the infrastructure law has contained a lot of big successes in terms of programs like the low or no electric bus program with increased funding for that, as well as the Safe Streets and Roads for All grants, which delivers planning and capital grants for small communities across the country to improve active transportation networks, as well as electric vehicle infrastructure programs like the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure program, charging and fueling infrastructure program, a lot of great smaller programs to build out equitable and climate-friendly transportation and mobility options. However, the majority of the infrastructure law was oriented around continuing existing policy and programs, specifically in the highway program. Funding had increased by 90% over previous levels in the FAST Act, while transit was closer to 70%. Rail, of course, did see a huge boost, but again, the majority of the focus in this bill was still on highway infrastructure and building that out with the same underlying policy. So that underlying policy that I'm talking about in those programs, we focus mostly on the 7 major highway formula programs, which make up about $273 billion over the authorization of the IIJA. But those programs don't necessarily have to be spent entirely on highway projects such as resurfacing or highway expansion. Instead, they could go to many different kinds of projects contained within the eligibilities of those 7 programs. So that includes transit capital improvements, EV infrastructure, bike ped infrastructure, climate resiliency improvements, as well as intermodal and rail freight, and much more. On top of that, that funding available under the federal highway program could be transferred out to transit, which is broadly speaking a climate-friendly mobility option. So prior analyses of the infrastructure law found that how states would spend these flexible federal formula fund programs would determine where their emissions trajectories would go in the long term. Specifically, Georgetown Climate Center recently in 2023 conducted an analysis of how different levels of investment in different categories and strategies would result in differing emissions portfolios. So, for instance, if states had spent 22% of their infrastructure law funds on highway expansion, they'd result in a high emissions trajectory. And they outlined several other portfolio investments that would have come about by investing that federal highway dollars towards either transit or electrification or other modes. So to take a look at how the infrastructure law was being spent in states today, we took a look at spending data from usaspending.gov, looking through awards that have been tagged as funded by the infrastructure law. In total, by the end of this analysis, we looked at over 64,000 grants. And this is where the AI portion came in. We had used large language models to sort through the project descriptions of these projects and award grants to determine what type of project type they were, and then cross-tabbed those with emissions figures for every $1,000 invested that have been determined and modeled by Georgetown Climate Center as part of their transportation investment strategies tool. So in total, we looked through about $150 billion in award obligations. And that means funds that have been obligated by the federal government and set to be spent on specific projects. And when we conducted this analysis initially in February, we found that a very significant portion of the bill had been spent towards capacity expansion projects, and even received some coverage for that as well. But essentially, of all of the dollars that have been coming out, the vast majority of it has been going towards highway projects, specifically highway expansion. And those investments have consequences to the tune of, on net, 42 million tons of emissions increased over baseline levels before the infrastructure law from induced travel enabled by those highway expansions. This is a waterfall chart describing how the emissions reducing strategies have to walk back emissions increases from these high emissions highway projects. So without accountability, we can expect the formula fund programs to continue to drive emissions this direction. This is a chart describing how states have been using their federal highway formula fund program funds. And with just the formula fund programs alone, we're seeing over 33% of dollars going to highway expansion projects. And the largest contributors of emissions in the federal highway program right now come from the National Highway Performance Program and the Surface Transportation Block Grant. In total, we found that $31.1 billion had gone to expansion projects under these two programs. And that's about 83% of all funding that has gone to expansion projects in this data set. That leads to about 64 million tons of CO2 equivalent emissions to be produced over baseline emissions levels through 2040. And we found that translating those figures to the EPA's greenhouse gases equivalencies calculator to be equal to about 16,000 wind turbines running for a year undone. And so another great thing about this data set in terms of the level of specificity we're able to get it down into, we were able to take a look at how different states were emitting at different levels based on how our awards were tagged on the USA spending data set. And with this, we found that Texas was one of the highest ranked, by far the most emitting states due to their investments weighted so heavily towards highway expansions. But interestingly, we also found that California was one that had been investing a lot in both emissions reduction and also emissions increasing projects to the tune of them being one of the worst on net, undoing a lot of their own climate commitments. So I'm sure a lot of folks familiar with the bill might be curious about what the impact is of discretionary grant programs. And with this data set, we do kind of have a lagging factor in that many of those projects are announced but not yet obligated. So we actually took a look at how these investment awards have been made so far based on a data set provided by the Biden administration on invest.gov. So we looked at over 1,000 awards logged there and found that the majority of those are going to things like transit and specifically very large investments in passenger rail. But we also want to contextualize that the amount of funding in this analysis of programs and projects that are announced but not yet obligated going towards into kind of an uncertain administration, it still represents less than half of the funding from federal highway formula programs that have already been obligated to specific projects. And on net, the emissions reduction from these discretionary grants is not enough to undo the emissions increase that we can expect from the state-led projects. And taking a look even further down to the level of what year certain projects are obligated, we found that the first fiscal year of the IIJA saw the largest spending on highway projects, highway expansion projects, but it has remained a continued priority across states and well into the future as these projects are still being built out. And broadly, with taking a look at how fast states are able to spend down money. So, of all project types that have been obligated to funding towards, this is the rate at which they're being outlaid. And of highway projects, they're on average 53% of those obligated funds have been outlaid, meaning spent down entirely, whereas transit projects and electrification projects are lagging behind significantly, getting those projects towards completion. And this is a bit about what funds we've looked at in this analysis. We've looked at 54 billion from the National Highway Performance Program, and there's just not been a significant amount of obligations out of the Congestion Mitigation and Air Quality Program, the Carbon Reduction Program, and Protect Program so far. But from those existing projects that we analyzed in this data set, we found that for every $1 million invested into any of them, you could expect a different level of emissions to come out of each program. So for instance, under the National Highway Performance Program, we expect 672 tons of emissions to be added between now and 2040 for every $1 million invested. And for the National Highway Freight Program, over 1,200 tons of emissions added because that program specifically is being used to expand highways more than any other Formula Fund program. So before we go into questions, I also want to go through how this data can be used by folks for advocacy. I mentioned that there was a lot of opportunities to use it at the state level. So taking a look at our report, we have different levels of geography that people can use on an interactive level, working through different states and rankings on that level as well. But we also have county level data for much of these projects, and where we could map them out, we did. We have ranked counties, and also you can search by county throughout our data set. But we also have an even more in-depth set of data available online on the report if you go to the appendix. And I'd also like to say it's worth reading our methodology to understand the limitations of our data as well, how we came to those figures, and why things like resurfacing are emissions reducing and how that works with our methodology. Scrolling down through our website, you can see one of these tables right here. I'd recommend this one to start building out charts out of. So this is the funding by project type by state with emissions. And you'll see a table with a lot of columns that can be used and copied by users into your own spreadsheet to create tables and charts for your own state level advocacy. And we also have a download link for this data at the bottom of our charts. And you can use those to create fact sheets, perhaps like this one, where you can sort how states have been spending the IIJA, as well as using those emissions figures to make equivalencies and communicate these emissions shifts in ways that resonate with people. For instance, Illinois' funding towards highway expansions would increase net emissions equivalent to about 2.2 natural gas powered power plants running for a year. So there's still a lot of opportunities left in the infrastructure law. The majority of the funding is actually still to be obligated, uh, and as well as the discretionary grants have yet to be obligated as well with finalized funding agreements between states and recipients. And influencing STIP and TIP project selection processes would be an opportunity to move these final dollars towards better outcomes, especially looking forward to this next administration. However, if this pattern of investment continues along these lines with projects going to the same types of with funding going to the same types of projects, we could expect that nearly 190 million tons of new emissions would be added, which is about the equivalent of 50 coal-fired power plants running for a year. So on that note, I'm going to open it up to Q&A in the chat.
Thanks so much for the presentation, Corrigan. And yes, please, everyone, throw your questions into the chat. I have a question for you, though, to start. So you've been deep in this data for a really long time. There's a lot of interesting findings there as you go deeper, but I want to bring this back out big picture. So what are sort of the 2 or 3 headlines that you think people should take away from this report?
Yeah, I think the big thing to understand is that the Formula Fund programs are extremely important when it comes to the climate impact of transportation. Because of the way that they're structured right now, states really don't have any obligation to think about climate in their transportation programming. So, because of that, we're going to see states using these dollars to award projects that fulfill other priorities, like uh, attempted attempts at decreasing highway congestion, which we know at a certain point just does not work thanks to things like induced demand and development. So, additionally, we found that, and we didn't really get into it in this report, in this briefing here, but rural and urban places, emissions differ significantly between the two. So rural counties and states, people often think of them as where emissions growth tends to be coming from. But based on the projects that we saw in this report, the majority of emissions are coming from urbanized areas where there could be spending going towards things like public transit and active transportation, which would be much more impactful for the climate. So a lot of the focus on decarbonizing rural places versus urban gets kind of skewed there. I see one question in the chat about Texas, California, and other states in the top 10 being large area-wise. So the emissions figures come essentially from how much money has been invested. So formula fund programs do tend to be bigger in states with more population, which Texas and California lead the nation in. But we also have opportunities to look through this data on a per capita basis, and we have some data in this report that does get into this. So Texas definitely does emit more per capita than California. And it's also important to think that California is investing more in things that do reduce emissions. So their net emissions would be much worse if they weren't investing in things like the LA Metro, Caltrain, those sort of projects.
Thanks for
So
answering.
yep. And then I see another from John Howard. So, how do the future emissions estimates factor in EV adoption? So, these were developed before the Inflation Reduction Act by Georgetown Climate Center, but it was a moderate adoption rate of EVs were plotted in their original tool. And to really dig into how it's factored on a modeled level, I'd suggest going through Georgetown Climate Center's Transportation Investment Strategies tool documentation. But there is an adoption curve factored into this, and it's not really assuming that our fleet today is going to be the same at 2030 or anything like that.
Thanks, Corrigan. I have another question for you about the AI powered analysis and how you went through the data. So, why did you have to use AI? How much data did you go through? Tell us a little bit about your process of collecting the data to analyze it.
Yeah, so in many ways, this might not be the ideal way to go through all of the transportation spending in the United States. We're limited only to federal data because that is where the best source to kind of look through project descriptions can come from. So right now, projects across the United States are listed in state transportation improvement programs. And those aren't necessarily very accessible when it comes to data. They come in various formats from PDF. I've seen slideshows with project listings on them, to spreadsheets, to online dashboards. They're all in very inconsistent formats. And one way we got around that to take a look at investments across the country was using the USA Spending data set, which is a website that logs all federal obligations that the government makes. Um, that website included project descriptions for all of these different transportation projects. And we use the AI to take categorization of different types of projects with examples and also descriptions of what to look for, and sorted the different projects into the different categories associated with emissions. And when we did that, it was able to give us a lot of different insights into how states were spending these federal dollars in ways that we really hadn't in the past. And we're hoping to, if we get the opportunity, to scale this up to STIPs, but it's a lot more manual effort to do so.
Great. Thanks, Corrigan. We have two questions in the Q&A and a question in the chat.
Great. And so I'll read Jared. So have correlations been found between states with emissions trading schemes and how states have funded emissions reductions with the IIJA? So we actually haven't done that analysis necessarily. I think with the data set that I had mentioned that's available online in the appendix, you might be able to do that in your own work as well. And I think I see another question from you, Jared. Will this information be shared with the ASCE, the American Society of Civil Engineers, with their 2025 report card in mind? Yeah, we have the data there listed online in that appendix as well. Folks are free to go through it. We also recognize that with going through projects using AI, there's a lot of uncertainty, and I think it's very warranted about AI and how it works. So we have an excerpt of our projects listed online in the methodology of our paper. So feel free to go through that and check through how we've categorized projects and understand what specifically is our biases or how we consider certain projects to be categorized as certain things.
I have another question, Corrigan. So at Transportation for America, we celebrate states like Colorado and Minnesota for the laws that they pass and the work that they're doing towards emissions reductions. And looking at the map from Fueling the Crisis, it looks like they're not doing as well as I might have expected them to do. So why haven't states like Colorado and Minnesota and others had better results?
So a lot of that's because this data is it's backwards looking. It's looking at the projects that have been funded between 2022 and June 2024. And for Minnesota, the law has not yet really been fully implemented yet. And the projects that had been funded with IIJA dollars so far have been from or had already been on state transportation improvement programs before those bills had passed, meaning they just really hadn't been a factor yet in project selection until very recently. But looking forward and looking through the STIPs on those states as it is today, they're much more likely to get them towards lowering their emissions. And with states like California, where there's similar VMT reduction goals, a lot of that unfortunately just goes to show how those efforts are going in terms of implementation. And unfortunately, California still has a long way to go to making sure that their policies are actually enacted in a way that get them to their climate goals. And there was a recent bill passed in California, AB 2086, that would hopefully work to make that a reality by adding a new dashboard to the state and ensuring that investments are justified. And I also see another question in the chat from Susan Barrett. So, how much of a state's formula funding can be flexed, and what is the best way to encourage that if you are a citizen or city/town or local official? So, 50% of funding can be flexed between federal highway program fund programs. So something like the National Highway Performance Program could go to the carbon reduction program, for instance. But also on top of that, states can transfer with pretty much as much discretion to federal transit agency projects or transit administration projects and programs, so long as the projects are the same between both buckets, if that makes sense. So they have a lot of flexibility to transfer out to transit, and they also have eligibilities to transfer to things like EV charging and active transportation networks. Um, how much might vary depending on the state and the maintenance needs of the state or how much has been spent so far. And we could potentially work with folks to answer those questions in the future. But in this report, I think we have a lot of data that could be helpful at answering the question of what's been done so far and how much room is there to improve. I see another one about resurfacing highways and roadways and that decrease. So Chandler, can you go a bit more into how resurfacing highways and roadways is a net decrease of CO2 emissions? Do the efficiency benefits have diminishing CO2 emissions reduction returns as roadways degrade as compared to travel demand management, which induces less vehicle travel? So, and this is again kind of getting into the methodology of Georgetown Climate Center's Transportation Investment Strategy tool. But they found in their report that resurfacing reduces friction on the roads between tires, and in that way, it reduces um, the amount of energy required to get cars moving and keep them moving, increasing fuel efficiency. Um, but yeah, as you said, they have diminishing returns as the highways degrade over time. And strategies like travel demand management, they allow for essentially the removal or total shift of vehicles off of the road. So the reason why, though, highway resurfacing tends to have the most benefit out of these is because they tend to have some of the greatest investment levels of any of the obligations we've looked at so far. But again, that would be more into the documentation of that Georgetown tool.
Thanks, Corrigan. If there are any final messages or questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A. But I guess looking forward, right, the IIJA was included in the last transportation reauthorization. It runs through September 2026, I believe. What should folks be thinking about as we're looking towards the next transportation reauthorization package?
Yeah, so there is going to be a lot of opportunities to work with states right now in the meantime as federal policy develops, because there is still funding left in the IIJA, and that funding is relatively safe going forward until reauthorization. But it's important to keep engaged with federal representatives and ensure that the next bill doesn't take steps backwards from the good things that had occurred under the IIJ. There were still massive benefits and wins for transit. But unfortunately, we're advocates are going to be on the defense, I think, for this next reauthorization that might be written between now and the following 2 years. But there's a chance that the infrastructure law will get extended and that might change things. But in the meantime, there's a lot of things to focus on in terms of how responsible we're being with our investments towards things like highway expansions, which we know consistently thanks to things like induced demand don't really return bang for your buck when it comes to reducing congestion.
Thank you so much. And with that, I want to thank you, Corrigan, for the presentation, for your great work on the report, for all of the interviews that you've been doing that I've been asking you to do. Keep an eye out for Corrigan on C-SPAN, everyone. But thanks everyone for attending. You can find the report in the chat. Really welcome you to take a look at it. As Corrigan mentioned, you can access the data yourself, so you can do some of the analysis that Corrigan did. And if you have any questions, reach out to us at info@smartgrowthamerica.org. We'd be happy to take them, meet with you, and things like that. But appreciate you all. Have a good day and enjoy the rest of your December.
Thanks, folks.